All right, so we have formative and summative assessment tasks. And in university, we're constantly told, try and steer away from the summative assessment tasks, like standardised tests and things like that. Do you think the formative assessment tasks can actually replace summative ones?
Can formative tasks replace summative ones? I don't mean to cop out on this question, because it's a really good question, but I think the answer has to be yes and no, and I'll justify that. I think the answer is yes, in that, like, what's the point of an assessment task, right? I would say, broadly speaking, within school, there are two primary functions. There are others as well, but two primary functions that every assessment performs for us. Number one, it is a representation and measurement of student attainment, right? It's like, okay, I need to know what you're capable of doing, right? That's going to be helpful because it enables, like, it feeds into, and this is part of my no answer, it feeds into our ability to understand you as a person, and then think about, well then where should that lead you? Like, what decisions should you make about what you do after school, or indeed what you do within school, those kinds of things, right? So understanding that, like, we don't rank people or give them grades for the sake of doing that. If you can imagine being a parent and having no sense at all of, like, how's my kid going in subject XYZ, that's a really crippling position to be in. So assessment performs a really helpful role to help us understand the student, right? So that's the first function. The second function is, and this leans into the difference between formative and summative, it's also to modify how we teach, right? So if I assess you and I'm like, oh, okay, you've got trigonometry and right angled triangles down pat. I can move on. I can introduce the ideas that use that as a foundation, right? Or the assessment might tell me, oh, I explained this terribly. Like, no one has any idea what's going on. They're like, sine, cos, tan, I don't know, they're all the same to me, right? That signals to me, okay, I really need to adjust in this way. Maybe spend more time on this, or find a whole new explanation, all those kinds of things, okay? Now, between formative and summative assessment, like, both types of assessment actually do both, but of course formative assessment is more leaning towards the second, and summative is more leaning towards the first, right? Now, being that I believe they really do overlap, functionally, can formative assessments replace summative assessments? Yes. Because formative assessments still help us understand and therefore make a value judgment on, does this student understand this concept or not? Can they perform the skills or not? A formative assessment can do that just like a summative one can. The reason why, though, I would say no. Formative assessments will never fully replace summative assessments. It has to do this with this very complicated and multifaceted environment that we function in as teachers, as educators. Schools have what we would call lots of stakeholders, lots of people who really care about what's happening in this classroom, what is the output of this classroom. Universities, employers, parents, everyone actually wants some kind of, I want to be able to draw the line in the sand and have a, let's use NAPLAN as an example, right? I want to be able to have a comparison across every student. They've all done the same task. They've all, like every school I can now compare, right? I can say, actually, you know what? This school is doing an amazing job given the challenges that they've faced. This school is not. And the way I knew is because I have a measure that goes across all of them at a single point in time that's consistent. That's the definition of summative assessment, right? So from a teaching and learning point of view, formative assessment does everything I absolutely need. I couldn't give two hoots about who's position 5 and who's position 29 in my class. What I really need to know is, do they understand this? Do they not understand that? So as a teacher focused on learning, formative assessment can do everything for me. But I also know that more people care about what's happening in this classroom than just me. And I have a responsibility and accountability to all of those external stakeholders. And for many of those purposes, there isn't a replacement for summative assessment. Formative assessment can't do that. You know, if it's different every single time, it's like, how can I get some sort of consistent sense of all of you? That's really quite impossible, practically speaking. So that's why it's a bit of a yes and no at the same time.
And that's so tough because some kids struggle under the formative assessment things and can't show how much they know in a formative assessment. And so I think I've got the words around the wrong way.
Yeah.
They can't show what they mean in a summative assessment. And whereas their teacher knows they can do so well. Like I have had that experience last year with a bottom year 9 class, and I know these kids can do the work, but when it comes to exam time and they're under pressure, they can't show it. And so for them, it's almost not worthwhile to summatively assess them, but you do have those other stakeholders, and so it's so tough to judge that as a teacher as to what to do.
You're 100% right. And to recognise that there's that tension there is important. There's a sentence that I've written hundreds of times in half-yearly reports that I loathe writing every time I write it, but I had to write it. It was the only appropriate thing to say. Of all these students, I would write, this result does not accurately reflect David's capability in this subject. And I hated writing it because I was like, I know that this student can do so much better than this exam shows that they can. And what I want to convey to the parent is, don't give up hope. Like, I know this number is somewhat depressing, or maybe it isn't depressing, but it's not what you wanted it to be. But I actually see much more than just this exam is a very narrow lens on your capacity. So we as teachers, I think, it's incumbent on us to do better for our students and assess them in a variety of ways. And sometimes that makes our job a lot harder and a lot more complex. But I think if we take seriously our responsibility to students, we should do that. And it also has implications for leaders to provide teachers the environment in which they can spend the time to do that.
Question on reports, and I know it's probably jumping a bit further, but having seen some of the report process and seen how inadequate it is because there are such constraints on teachers, how do you go about reporting to parents how a kid is actually doing when you can't say what you want to in a written report?
Sure. This is one of those places where I think as secondary teachers we can learn a lot from our primary colleagues. Not that any way of doing this is perfect. Every choice you make is a compromise when you're dealing with human beings. There's not the way. But one of the things I've learned, like I have children who, well, they're not anymore, but they used to all be in primary school, and seeing things from a parent's point of view has been so illuminating to me, and trying to understand, like, oh, what's going on here? It's true, of course. Can you imagine, right? Like, every 6 months, to only know at that point of view, like, can you imagine teaching a class for 6 months before finding out whether you were doing a decent job of teaching them or not? Like, you find out instantly. You haven't even finished your sentence and they're bored or they're excited, or like, we have a great instant feedback loop. Having to wait even a week to know, like, were any of those lessons any good? That would be disastrous, right? So to have a closer feedback loop is really important. One of the things which I really liked to do as a head teacher was, part of my job was to call parents of students who were troubled, were having behavior issues and that kind of thing. And I got really sick of just having negative interactions with, like, sorry, I have to make this phone call, I know you don't want to hear this. And so I was like, you know what? We should actually, like, who said we only have to have negative phone calls? Why don't we? And I started asking teachers, tell me who's doing some great work in your classes, or who you're really proud of how far they've improved. And I want to call those parents. I want to find out who they are, right? And taking the initiative to do that is really valuable, and being accessible. We have to have some caution, of course, is if you teach 150 students, that means you have, potentially 300 parents and guardians who it's like, whoa, okay, this rapidly becomes, what's the word I'm looking for? It becomes impractical to try and maintain those lines of communication across everybody. But I would say, that it's really important not to feel constrained by the structures that we have. Yeah, there are lots of things you can't say in the 3 sentences of the semesterly report, not just because there's only 3 sentences, but because of like style reasons and that kind of thing. And so I think it is important. Like I would often send a note home in a student's book. I just write a thing down, right? And I'd say, hey, just make sure you show your parents this, you know? Sometimes it would be sending an email. It's one of the reasons why parent-teacher nights are so important, because even when you only have 5 or 10 minutes with a parent, sometimes in the space of that time, what you can convey to a parent about their child is enormous. And I've had many times where a student, like I always find this slightly awkward, I don't know if this ever happened to you, at parent-teacher night, where the parent like comes to sit down and then, I don't know if you as a student ever did this, but the student then comes along and awkwardly stands in the back there and they have to listen to the whole conversation that is clearly not intended for them, but they just kind of have to be, you know, fly on the wall. And sometimes that can go really badly. Like sometimes the parents will sit there with their arms folded and they'll be like, see, this is what I've been, and they can really feel just hit by a bus. But I really like sometimes having that opportunity, because as teachers, we see a whole different side of a child compared to what a parent does. Like I know that as a parent as well as a teacher. And so I think it is a wonderful thing within the bounds of what, you know, doesn't make us go crazy and you know, be exhausted because we've created such a huge mountain of work for ourselves, within the boundaries of that, to say, you know what, I'm going to drop an email to this parent and say they're doing this, or maybe they need some help with that. Sometimes you do that via other people within the school, like your head teacher or a year advisor or a stage head teacher. Using all those avenues, I think, is really important, especially for us as secondary teachers, because as kids get older, we know this, right? Parents sort of get like there's a tendency for parents to get out of the loop of what's happening in their child's education. And I think we should do our best to amend that.
Awesome.